Joining us now, Jared Bernstein, Senior Fellow at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. He was Chief Economist to Vice President Biden. He's also an MSNBC contributor. And also with us, Joy Reid, MSNBC National Correspondent and the host of AM Joy on the weekends here at MSNBC. And Joy, raising the bottom tax rate. I'm telling you, the second I saw it, I went, you know, because when George W. Bush got that right in 2001, I thought, wow, the Republicans have figured out this particular piece of the talking points. Not now.
Can I just say that, by the way, in your earlier poll when we first came on and you said who is skeptical, I voted for Tiffany, so I hope you'll retweet me.
Oh, you did? Yeah, okay,
I voted for Tiffany, so please retweet me. You know, it's interesting. Donald Trump has this way of exposing his party and elements of it that the party had worked for decades to try to hide, right? So Republicans for decades have tried to obscure this idea that they're this monocle-wearing monopoly man party that just wants to give the rich everything and hurt the poor. But Donald Trump keeps exposing them for being exactly that. So here you have Donald Trump, who is essentially, because he doesn't really know anything, kind of captive to the monocle-wearing part of the party, the Paul Ryans of the world, who really do just want to take the tax code and transfer as much money as possible to the very rich, give all the money to the very rich, get rid of the estate tax, essentially reinstitute the sort of feudal system. And Donald Trump at least has the decent enough political instinct, because he's a salesman, and he understands the people he's selling $40 hats to, it's not those guys. The people he's selling low-rate hotels to, it's not those guys. So he at least understands, wait a minute, if we soak the poor right off the bat, we're exposing ourselves as the Goldman Sachs party. So at least he knows that. The sort of funny thing about it is the Republicans just think they can use Donald Trump to do the monopoly man, monocle-wearing thing and have him sell it to the broke people.
It's what Grover Norquist has always said. We just want a Republican president to sign this stuff, just to sign it. And Jared Bernstein, it should be remembered that none of the current Republican congressional leadership on tax policy had any of these jobs when the Bush tax cuts were going through as have them now. So none of them actually have experience with any of this. And the president himself being the one to spot that bottom tax rate and say, what are we doing? It is, by the way, also the simplest thing in the bill to spot. It's not one of the more complicated ones.
Yeah, I've been astounded to hear the commentary coming out of these rookies. So, for example, today, Steve Mnuchin, Treasury Secretary, he didn't just go out and say, this tax cut is going to be deficit neutral. It's not going to increase the deficit. We've heard that lie already, and I guarantee you, as would any other economist on both sides of the aisle who's not getting paid by the Trump administration would guarantee you the same thing. Of course the deficit is going to go up if you cut taxes this deeply. So they used to say, no, it's not going to increase the deficit. Today, Mnuchin went out and said, not only are we going to pay for the tax cut, a couple of $1 trillion in tax cut, but we're going to end up with a revenue positive outcome. This is going to raise another $1 trillion. So it's almost as if they're saying, you know, we told them that it's not going to cut taxes on the rich, and, you know, that isn't really working. We told them it's going to be deficit neutral. That isn't working. So let's see what else we have in our, you know, in our back pocket here. And so they're just kind of shuffling through the deck to try to sell this thing. And I think you and Joy are exactly right. Trump may not know what the heck he's talking about. I don't understand tax policy. But, boy, he can sniff out the kind of thing that's not going to work with his base. And we saw that with health care. It does seem to be morphing in a similar way. The administration tells you, hey, everybody, this is going to be great for you. And then the scorekeepers start getting a hold of it, and it looks extremely different.
You know, I never thought I'd say this, and this could change, but so far, Donald Trump is the best salesperson. He's the best salesperson they have on the tax bill so far. Listen to Gary Cohn in the White House press briefing today telling you what not to look at in the tax bill. Please don't look at the details. Listen to this.
The one thing I would beg you all to do is don't look at any one piece. Look at the plan in its entirety. That's how we're looking at tax reform. We're looking at it in its entirety.
Joy, don't look at what I have in this hand. Just look at what I have in this hand here. Don't, please, no details.
Donald Trump, at least, Donald Trump knows he's the guy who's got to go sell this to the base. So he knows Gary Cohn doesn't have to do it. Steve Mnuchin is too busy flying his actress wife to sit on the roof of whatever, Treasury building he's flying on. He is surrounded by people who he hired, by the way, who fly around in corporate jets, the best people who fly around in corporate jets when they could take commercial, who are using these government jobs to live fabulous lifestyles of the rich and famous. They're not the ones who have to go sell this in Poughkeepsie. They're not the ones who have to go to Sheboygan and convince the Trump voter that this is okay. He's got to do that. So Donald Trump understands that all of these things that Republicans keep saying, which we all know are lies. Deficit neutral, that's a lie. Not going to lower taxes on the super rich, that's a lie. All of these lies, Trump has to sell them. So since he's a salesman, and that's the one thing he's really actually kind of good at, he knows he can't sell that. Even he cannot sell that to the base.
Let me tell you, are you surprised that Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell, and the others have not been better salesmen for this, and Trump is the best one they have so far?
What can you sell? I mean, So, but let me go, and that actually is the point I wanted to make. What I think Gary Cohn was talking about there was the middle class. So they say it's not going to cut taxes on the rich. That's patently, I mean, that may be the biggest lie of all, because you get rid of the estate tax. Remember, the estate tax only hits the top 0.2, the richest 0.2% of estates. You cut the corporate rate. Well, who does that help? You get rid of the AMT. That's $31 million for Trump, according to the New York Times tonight. But the middle class, now they're trying to tell you that this is actually going to help the middle class. Well, people are starting now to crunch the numbers. The details are coming out. We don't have all of them yet. We need more. But it looks like taxes will actually go up for some middle class families. And the reason is that they're getting rid of the personal deduction, the personal exemption. They double the standard deduction, and that helps a lot of low-income families. But they get rid of the personal exemption, which is about $4,000 per person for people who take that exemption. Now, I'm not going to get into the gnarly bits of the code, but people are starting to crunch the numbers and figuring out that there are some families, typically with a couple of kids in the upper part of the middle class, who look like, based on what we know so far, they're going to get a tax increase. So, yeah, that's the kind of thing you don't want people looking at if you're Gary Cohn.
Steve Mnuchin and possibly Gary Cohn are going to find themselves testifying to the Senate Finance Committee about this, and they are going to get shredded in there with the way this bill stands right now and with what they're trying to push right now. We're going to have to leave it there for tonight. Jared Bernstein, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.